So at the beginning of last year, we were happily embarking on our third electric sailboat conversion project. One of our former customers had reached out to us saying he had a 32-foot boat that was up on the yard for work and had a diesel engine that was kind of in need for replacement. He co-owned this boat with a fellow retired engineer as well, and they thought they'd be perfect candidates for testing out one of these electric systems that he'd been following on our YouTube channel. So I had a look at his setup, and sure enough, it did seem like an ideal case. And even though we weren't actively working on the sailboat project at that time, we had a lot of leftover parts from our experiments with Shamrock, and so we just gifted him some hand-me-down motors and controllers and batteries in order for them to just check the system out. And being retired engineers as they were able to figure it all out, including all the controller hookups and custom throttle, with very little hand-holding from us. And in short order, we're happily motoring around Bowen Island with the new electrified sailboat. And it worked super well. I was actually quite surprised when we did a plot of the power consumption versus speed on their boat, even though it's a larger boat, 30 feet versus the 25 feet of Shamrock, and with the heavier displacement, it actually used slightly less energy to hit all the target speed.
Typically we'll use maybe 500 watts on our cruising. We're not going anywhere fast. A bunch of geriatrics, being super conservative with all of this tech until we figure it all out.
500 watts is, wow, it's really 2 knots.
They were quite easily able to sustain just over 5 knots with only 2 kilowatts of power. And for what they were doing, that was really more than sufficient. These guys had a sailboat because they like to sail. They just needed the motor to get in and out of the harbor and deal with reef conditions of no wind. So they only actually wanted a small battery pack.
This is running a relatively small battery bank compared to Shamrock. There's 6 of these 48 volt, 35 amp hour lithium iron phosphate battery packs hooked up in parallel. But Chris uses this almost entirely as a sailing boat, so he just needs the battery to get in and out of harbor, and is mostly taking the wind from there.
For all of their sailing needs that summer, it proved to be more than adequate. So this ended up being doubly fortunate for us for a totally different reason. As you can see in the background here, there's no more sailboats or boats of any kind at our marina. And we got notice at the beginning of last year that all boats were being evicted as they were going to tear down the old dilapidated docks. And that left us with no real home to store Shamrock anymore. And it just so happened that Chris had a spare moorage buoy out on Bowen Island, which he offered us to use.
Shamrock! Hey!
That situation worked out pretty wonderfully. It's not quite as convenient as having the sailboat literally right beside your float house, but it was just a short bus ride and ferry to get to where she was moored, and then we were right in the middle of House Sound for going on convenient day sails or trips around the area. Even though we didn't have shore power in order to keep the batteries charged, being out in the middle of the bay, the sun and solar panels ensured that every time we came to the boat, we had a full battery bank to start off our trip with. So that was all going along rather well, and we were slated to move from the mooring buoy into a slip at the beginning of November. So it was rather tragic when I opened my phone on October 21st and saw this message from Chris. So that was a curveball I was not expecting to have to deal with. Luckily, a bunch of Grin staff were keen to help us out in this dire situation, and we hopped on a ferry and got ourselves over to Bowen as soon as we could. Now, the boat was fully underwater at that point, and the low tide wasn't until 3 in the morning, so we basically had to stake it out and wait until the tide exposed the boat to actually see what had happened.
All right, so here we have Shamrock, and it has busted loose from its mooring buoy and is totally beached. And it completely submerged, meaning that there's some sort of hole that we're gonna try and patch. How you feeling, Justin?
What?
How you feeling?
Super optimistic. The rudder's not busted, the hole's not smashed up from the rocks, and it drained itself.
And our first sights looked kind of promising. As we approached the vessel on the beach, it seemed to be more or less intact and just beached for some reason or another. But then when we got around to the other side, we could see that things were a lot more dire. It managed to land right on some big boulders.
The sailboat ender.
And with the pounding waves, those had crushed through gaping holes in the side of the boat, and it was going to be quite an effort in order to salvage this.
We'll still pull all the batteries out of it and get...
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, let's get that, and all the tools definitely. None of the cushions or boat stuff, but we might as well the life jackets, those kind of things.
Okay. Well, at least that means we're not going to be super pressed for time.
No, it's true. The barbecue is kind of shitty. So the solar panels, if that panel array, let's see if we can lift that out of the water. Yeah. So we'd basically, So there is basically the trick if we wanted to would be to take the halyard and then tie a rope to the dock over there, and then when the water at high tide, you then would just tug on that rope, flip it to the other side, then the tide goes out this side high. Hope it doesn't put a hole on the other side.
It also let us see firsthand what the cause of the problem was. And as you can see from this photo here, the cleat that was tying us off to the mooring buoy had simply ripped right out of the hull of the boat. All this time I was worried about my knot tying or the rope fraying, but I didn't really give much thought that the cleat itself would become the weak point. Just a few days before this, there had been an atmospheric river event where Vancouver got doused with crazy heavy rains and some decently high winds, but nothing crazy storm-like, and no other boats got blown off. So it's still a little bit of a mystery as to just what circumstances caused our cleat to fail here. With the tide coming up, we did our best to empty all the contents of Shamrock that we could salvage, make sure any environmental debris was taken out of the way, and it gave us one chance to tie the rigging to the very top of the mast so that our halyard was available to hopefully tip the boat over on its other side when the tide was up again.
She hit the tipping point. Go, go.
The trick with the halyard ended up working perfectly. A very friendly neighbor let us strap off to their dock and pier structure and do a block and tackle system that let us successfully pull the sailboat and tip it over to rest on the starboard side so the damaged side could be worked on.
So graceful. Well, I hope that was a soft landing.
Probably on that nice bed that you made for her. Look at all that air coming out of her.
Oh yeah, look at that.
And hopefully with the other side down, we'd be able to properly see and maybe patch the damage to the hull and get this boat floated without having to call on professional salvage crew. There's a local hardware store on the island, and I went there and bought up basically every last tube of 2-part epoxy that they had, a whole bunch of different silicone caulking compounds, and anything I thought might be useful in our attempt to patch this hull. I was lucky to have 2 different friends who were more than willing to come out on the last ferry that night and stake out until the tide was low and help in what turned out to be the craziest of all salvage nights. At this point, low tide was at 4 in the morning, so we set our alarms for about 3 a.m. and staked our way down to the beach where we could see the boat neatly laying over on the other side and the fully damaged hull fully exposed and visible. Now, unfortunately, the boat in this arrangement couldn't drain out, so the hull was full to the brim with water. So one of my buddies was there with a bucket, just bailing and bailing the entire boat cavity, while me and another friend were trying to figure out how are we going to patch all these holes. So we went around with the blowtorch to dry the epoxy, sanding equipment to clean the surface, and just cut out a bunch of random shapes of plywood, gooped up all kinds of silicone, and screwed them to the hull, hoping that that would give enough integrity and sealant to let the boat float when the tide came up again. What we didn't anticipate was just how long this was going to take. The tide wasn't as low as before, so we were already ankle deep in water to begin with, and as we were working through, the tide kept coming up and up till we were knee deep, waist deep, and then we were standing somewhat precariously on a stepladder trying to get these last pieces of wood in, while the boat was now bouncing around with each moving wave, and we were trying to ensure that as the tide came up, it would lift the boat up with her. So I went back home for the night and decided not to set any alarm and see where things sat the next day. When I woke up in the late morning and looked out the window, I could see the hull fully out of the water with Shamrock floating right where she had gone under a couple days before. At this point, our buddy Chris was able to come over in a Zodiac and tow Shamrock over to the nearby marina while I was trying to work out with insurance and salvage and towing companies just what the next steps were. Almost amazingly, the patchwork on the hull barely leaked a drop at all. The boat was able to stay up in the water like that for several days while we worked out a towing and salvage situation. And in the end, it turned out to be a lot less bad than I was fearing. People were telling me that salvaging a damaged sailboat like this was going to cost anywhere from $10,000 to $15,000. But in the end, it was just $2,600 to tow it to the nearest marina that can do sailboat salvage, and just $2,200 to actually scrap the boat itself.
Shamrock on the hard, and we went full scavenger mode and solder up for all the cleats and valuables that we can use later. Not a pretty sight, but yeah, thank you, Shamrock. Yes, and we have wall decorations indeed.
So it's interesting to see how different parts of the boat fared from being underwater like that for 3 to 4 days. So we'll start off with the most expensive part of the boat, and that was our lithium battery bank. And unfortunately, and not surprisingly, the battery bank was totally toast.
Oh, look at that. You can see
bubbling out.
you see it bubbling.
Yeah, so I think the smoke is, oh wow.
Now these packs were just standard cells wrapped in heat shrink tubing, and once it was submerged underwater like this, of course salt water got between all the different cell interconnects. It corroded the tabs. Some cells were corroded right through. When we pulled the battery up, there was of course constant gurgling and bubbling as various amounts of electrolysis were taking place, and there was no hope in heck of salvaging this. But it's not to say you couldn't make a totally submersion-proof battery pack. If you had a battery that was smart enough to detect when it was underwater via a couple sensing probes, then it could quite simply shut off its output so that it was 0 volts while it remained submerged. And in a situation like that, you could actually build a battery without too much difficulty that would be able to handle a complete submersion like this without any additional ill effects. So that giant solar panel arch that we made was strong enough to hold up to all of the winds that the boat had ever been on, but it did get ripped off the boat when it got underwater like this. Not too surprising given the massive force that waves will put on that large of a panel. But it ripped off pretty cleanly from the 3D printed mounts, and the 3 panels themselves were totally intact, as was most of the metal structure. So the motor controller that we ended up using in the final stage of Shamrock was the ASI BAC 4000 unit, and this controller is fully potted. So in theory it could handle this kind of submersion, but when we pulled it out, it was corroded to bejeebies, and it was all corroded clearly around the positive terminal. And even though I had turned the system off so that there was no voltage going directly to the motor controller when it went underwater, what I realized is that that on-off switch is just a small separated contact on the positive bus. As soon as the switch itself fills with water, well, that will conduct the voltage from the battery bank to the motor controller and allow the successive corrosion to take place. I'm pretty sure if I had just unplugged the motor controller from the battery completely, separating both the positive and negative terminals, rather than relying on a switch, the motor controller probably would have been able to power up and work fine again. As far as all the other boat electronics, the radios, the auto tillers, the DC to DC converters, the solar MPPT charge controllers, well, those all got completely clunkered, filled with water, and beyond any hope of operation again. And finally we get to the motor. And this bit interested me because the all-axle motor was never intended to be waterproof submersibly, but we did make it so that it was as splash-proof as we could. When we had Shamrock raised out of the water, I could actually quite freely spin the motor and was pretty sure that it might be salvageable. When we brought it back to Grin's lab and opened it up, it was about half filled with salt water, but really not that badly damaged. We gave it a good rinsing, clean off the little bit of superficial corrosion that had accumulated over the 3 days, and lo and behold, this motor runs just as good as new after having spent 3 days under the deep sea. And the best part of this whole salvage operation is that there was no worry at any point of having to deal with fluids. There was no giant diesel tank that was going to leak and contaminate the beach and require more extensive environmental cleanup. So with that saga all explained, we're now ready to talk about what we intended for this video, which was just relating what our experience was like with this electric drive system in the past few years. So first though, a little bit of a background on myself. I am not at all a sailor. Shamrock here was my very first sailboat, and we basically just lucked upon it when some neighbors at this marina who used it as a liveaboard upgraded to a larger boat and offered Shamrock to me for a song. I'd long been fascinated with this idea of sailing and kind of exploring the BC coast, but this was the first vessel that I got experience in. So in the first few years we had Shamrock, we were relying on the Yanmar 8 horsepower diesel that came with it. And mostly it was working pretty well, and I was pretty keen to actually learn and understand the mechanics of diesel engines. But if you followed that first video segment, at one point we noticed it consuming way more oil than it should be. And when I had a friend and myself decide to do an overhaul, we came to the realization that the engine was worn beyond any useful salvage. And that's when the idea of fully electrifying Shamrock really took hold. And when I realized that the parts that we made for electric bicycles were actually right in the right torque range necessary for a boat conversion. Now at this time, this is over 5 to 6 years ago, there were very few examples of electric sailboats either on the market or in DIY builds. It was a surprisingly untapped area for electrification, and I thought that with all of our experience in e-bikes and larger electric motorcycles, that we could be a good candidate to play a bit of a pioneering role on that front. Now, for a lot of people who are seasoned boaters, this idea of switching over to electric is somewhat terrifying because they really know and understand everything about the world of internal combustion engines for all of its flaws, but come to depend on count on that and are quite skeptical of anything modern and electric. I, of course, come from a totally different perspective, and every time I got to the boat, I had this great uncertainty about whether or not the engine would start, and if it didn't start, I was really kind of out of my element for knowing exactly what to do in order to rectify the situations. When it comes to electric motors, I know that stuff on the back of my hand. So in the last Shamrock video that we published, we just finished installing an extra wide solar array off the side of the boat and had managed to solar electric drive her from Vancouver to Sydney on Vancouver Island. That was the start of what was going to be the first of many nice family trips enjoying Shamrock for all she had to offer. My wife and daughter joined me at that point. We had no problem sailing and motoring our way all the way to Souk, which is my family hometown. We arrived there just as the sun was setting and just as the battery clocked down to 60 volts, which was kind of the very last legs, with what I thought was perfect timing and perfect coordination of our battery capacity. We spent a week with the family playing on the beach, meeting up with friends, all the while our sailboat sat there recharging itself from the sun. A week later, when we were ready to make our way back to Vancouver, the batteries were 100% charged. We took a more meandering route, stopping in Victoria, spending a couple nights camping over on Sydney Spit, meeting up with some friends on Main Island. Every time we stopped, the boat would gain a little bit more charge, and we had no problem using just solar energy to get ourselves all the way back to our home in Vancouver. Every year we took Shamrock on at least one pretty big trip crossing the Georgia Strait, going to places like Newcastle Island or Gabriola Island, and we do multiple weekend trips to nearer locations up in the Howe Sound or Sunshine Coast, and I'd often entertain friends coming over to visit us with little day trips around Vancouver Harbour. Let us go see the fireworks at night at Burrard Inlet. So my hope for Shamrock was to have a vessel that I could use with my growing family to go on short day trips around Vancouver, to explore a little further afield on the coast of British Columbia, and also to gain a lot of first-hand R&D experience in electric boat propulsion with the idea that Grin could maybe entertain doing electric sailboat conversion kits. And on that front, it really worked out perfectly. There wasn't a single time when I got to the boat and couldn't flip on the switch and with full confidence hit the throttle and see the engine spin.
With the power on, I just turn the dial and the motor runs. Flip the switch to reverse and I go in reverse.
Everything about the electric drive just worked without any hitches. And if there was a hitch, I had on board a full backup electric motor and motor controller that I could swap in with just 10 minutes or so of bolting and unbolting a few fasteners. So while I no longer had that anxiety or nervousness starting the diesel engine, there was always that slight concern on longer trips on just how much range we were going to get from the battery pack. And this was particularly exemplified by the very last trip that we took. In this case, I was bringing a bunch of our staff to a company retreat we were doing on Salt Spring Island. This is shortly before the fateful incident, and had planned that we would leave at about 6 in the morning in order to arrive 6 hours later at an important tidal crossing. I was counting on us basically moving at 5 knots, which is something we can easily sustain with the motor, normally at just 2 kilowatts. But I knew from some previous trips that the boat was going a bit slower than usual, and I suspected that we had some marine growth on the bottom. So I gave us an extra bit of buffer time, and I also brought some goggles and scraping equipment in case we wanted to take care of this. And of course, if we had any wind helping us, well, that would quickly get up to 5.5 or 6 knots, and we'd have no problem making this tidal cross.
So we've done 14 nautical miles in 3.5 hours. So somebody off camera do the math, but we're doing like 4.2 knots, I think.
So how are you going to clean the bottom of this boat?
I'm gonna scrape it clean.
Yeah? And you're feeling pretty good about
This is a
jumping
highly
into
professional tool for the job, actually.
14-degree water?
I think it'll be a race against time. So how cold I get.
Fortunately, everything kind of stacked up against us. In the early morning, it was just too dark for anyone to swim underwater and remove the growth, and the boat was moving slower than I'd remembered. In order to hit just 4 knots of cruising speed, we had to crank the motor all the way up to 3 kilowatts, and there's no way at 4 knots we were going to make that crossing in time. And unfortunately, at this point, we were in an area of the ocean that was super turbid from a river outflow, and even though we could get underwater, it was just too dark to see anything. So So we just kept crossing our fingers that a wind would pick up. So it was forecast to be 10 to 15 knots, but of course it remained dead calm the entire time. We arrived at the passage at a point we'd be fighting a huge tidal current, and even if we waited for the tide to change, we didn't actually have enough battery reserve anymore in order to make it to our final destination on Salt Spring Island.
Trying to squeeze a few more watt hours on this passage where we have not a hint of wind and a boat that's going a solid 1 knot slower than we were expecting from presumed growth on the bottom.
Luckily, the weather conditions were fine, and there was a nearby government wharf that we were able to tie up at, and luckily this also had electric power, so we were able to charge and top up the batteries at this point.
The ocean, as we got out into the Georgia Strait, was just like glass. No wind whatsoever. And it would have been fine if there was tons of sun, because we've been charging our solar panels, but it was cloudy. So we are just chugging along at minimum speed, hoping to make it all the way across before our battery died. And debating all the while whether we should gun it to try and make active pass or not.
But it really highlighted the kind of risks you take on when you do have an electric system and you're relying on that simple calculation that, oh, you can go at 5 knots and use 2 kilowatts. All it takes is some slightly change to the conditions and those calculations can fall apart pretty quickly. If you're facing any kind of strong headwind or going into heavy driving seas, suddenly 2 kilowatts of power might only get us about 3 knots of propulsion. And so you really don't have nearly this contingency of reserve that you do with an internal combustion engine in order to just motor your way through troublesome incidents like that. I'd hate to be caught in a storm or in any kind of really rough conditions, while at the same time metering our remaining battery reserve to try to make sure we didn't just fully run out of juice in an uncomfortable situation.
Thank you! We are here to save you! Big red.
This thing on the back. What are those called?
That's decomposing dinosaurs being put through there.
That's called saving our ass is what that's called.
Speed over ground, 32 nautical miles per hour.
So as a fair weather sailor who just uses this boat intermittently and doesn't go on too many long trips, it really worked out great. But I could see other people who are avid boaters and who want to be able to boat in all kinds of situations, that the fully pure electric drive like this would probably leave you more nervous than confident in a lot of scenarios. So with the boat safely at that's government wharf, we had no problem diving down and cleaning off the sheets and sheets of mussels that were at the very bottom of the keel and slowing us down. We, of course, had a great company retreat. Everyone enjoyed the time, and the return sail back to Vancouver went just without a hitch, with the motor and boat performing just as we'd come to expect from her.
Oh, big wave!
So one of the things that surprised me the most about this project was just how incredibly effective solar panels were at keeping the large battery bank charged up. Now, when we did that big installation with an extra 500 watts on the side so we could get a 1300 watt capture, I really thought that you needed that kind of solar coverage in order to make solar electric sailing practical. But after the first season, we ended up taking down the panels on the side because they more or less got in the way of our visibility and kind of interfered with the rigging when we wanted to actually sail. And it turned out that at the rate I was using the boat, taking it out once every 2 to 3 weeks, just the 500 watt panel alone on the arch was more than enough to keep a battery fully charged. With a 500 watt panel like this during the summer months, it basically puts in 2 to 2.5 kilowatt hours every single day. So over 2 weeks, that has no problem charging up a 24 kilowatt hour battery pack. So that would be a little bit different if we were doing really long trips, like going up to Desolation Sound or some of the more popular destinations out of here, where we only have enough electricity to get us more or less one way and would rely on solar charging for the return trip. But in that situation, instead of trying to deploy an enormous solar array on the boat itself, I think I would just mount solar panels on some lightweight styrofoam floats and simply float them out in the water beside the boat whenever we were at anchor. Not only would the water keep the solar panels cool, the panels wouldn't be obstructive at all to the boat, to the usage of the boat. They'd also be much more out of the way from the shadows cast by the masts and riggings that you have when you're dealing with panels mounted on the hull of the boat itself. And potentially, if you even wanted to have this extra solar while you're underway, you could just tow them behind the boat the same way that you tow a dinghy. If you need to capture solar energy while you're underway, it's because it's a sunny day with absolutely no wind and calm waters. Those seem like conditions where dragging a train of solar panels wouldn't be a big hindrance. So one of the things that made our usage of Shamrock so enjoyable was a relatively large battery bank that we had. We had 14 battery packs, each one 72 volt, 24 amp hours, giving us 24 kilowatt hours of battery capacity, which is a lot more than you see offered with many of the electric sailboat conversion systems that are out there on the market. With this large capacity, for most of the trips, we never had to give a second's thought about whether or not there was enough battery power for the kind of journeys we were doing. This is more or less the same as our experience with electric bikes and other land-based electric vehicles, in that nobody ever regrets having too large of a battery pack. It just opens up that many more possibilities and reduces that much more anxiety you'd have about their usage. If I wanted to fully replace the weight of the diesel that was on Shamrock plus a full fuel tank, I could have actually added upwards of 40 kilowatt hours total of lithium battery pack. And finally, thoughts on regenerative braking. So in land-based vehicles, I'm an extremely strong advocate and proponent of regen in almost all circumstances. And I was equally enthusiastic to see just how much of a role it can play while sailing. The idea seems really great and simple. When you're sailing with good winds, you simply peel off some of that wind energy to spin the propeller and charge up the battery pack so that you have a more recharged battery whenever the winds are down. And unfortunately though, even though there's tens of kilowatts of power available in the sails when you are in a nice windy breeze, the percentage of that you can actually harvest from a small fixed blade propeller like we have on Shamrock was pretty minuscule. I think the most we ever saw was about 120 to 130 watts. Now, a huge reason for that is because of the general inefficiency and sub-optimization of a fixed pitch propeller like this at doing that reverse process of capturing sailing energy. We know that properly engineered systems like Ocean Volt servo drive that have fully pitch controlled propeller blades are able to harvest more like 500 watts under those same power situations. But even then, we feel that the amount of energy you get from solar vastly eclipses what you gain back from regen. It's a nice thing to have on top, but our own experience has been that probably 2/3 of the time when we're out on the boat, there's no wind to sail at all, and we're really dependent on the motor just to move us along. So the share of times when we have a strong wind and can get extra regen energy is not making any real meaningful distance in the range that we get for that battery pack.
So one unexpected perk of the marina shutting down suddenly is a lot of boats were left without a home, and a lot of people were left scrambling trying to figure out what to do next. And finding a place to berth your boat in Vancouver is no small order. Most marinas have multi-year waiting lists for that. And as a result, a lot of boats ended up turning hands pretty inexpensively, and a large number even just got abandoned. So all that time we'd been enjoying Shamrock for what it had to offer, we were clearly at a stage of suffering two-footitis, where we were kind of longing for a boat that was just a little bit bigger in all regards. We wanted to have furling sails so that we didn't have to climb up aboard the deck every time we wanted to change the sail up. A larger berth. We thought it'd be great if we had an actual galley to cook inside. And we also found that most of the people inquiring about electric conversions were looking to convert a larger boat than 25 feet. Typically they were 30, 32, up to 36 feet. And so we'd always been keeping our eye out for a larger project that would be more representative of what it seems most people wanted. And that's when this beauty landed in our laps. So as the marina slowly got vacated over the course of springtime, there were fewer and fewer stragglers remaining until this was just one of 3 sailboats that had apparently been abandoned by the former owners. We inquired with the marina to find out what exactly was going to take place. They said, well, put in an offer. They're going to spend 6 months trying to contact the former owner, and otherwise we'll simply repossess the boat and put it up for auction. So we decided to bid exactly the same amount we'd paid for Shamrock, and woohoo! She was ours. So this boat had quite a striking look to it. It's a cutter rig with 2 foresails, which will be a nice learning experience for us. Stylistically, we found it's just so striking, having some really classic lines, and we came to learn that this is a Bayfield 32, which is quite a legendary boat design from Ontario, and one that has a coveted set of followers. Now it is a full whole-length keel, which is something that is not as maneuverable as what we used to have. Certainly backing up or steering in marinas is going to be more difficult, and it's also generally less efficient and slower. But on the plus side, it's a very heavy keel that's quite stable in high waves from what we've heard, with a fairly shallow draft. And as far as being just a fun family cruiser for exploring the coast, we think this is going to be the absolutely ideal candidate.
So when we first set sights on her, it looked like it hadn't been tended in at least 3 years or so. It was just covered in green slime and mold all over the top, and we had no real idea of the condition of the interior either. But once we got permission to cut the locks and poke our heads in, we saw that it had been really meticulously maintained and upgraded by the previous owners, and that really most of the damage that we could see was superficial. So when we won the bid in the fall, a bunch of Grin staff came out and we spent a couple of weekends giving a full scrubbing and power washing and cleaning, and then got this boat lifted up on the Heart, as you see here. One of the things that was quite attractive to us is that in the condition we found the boat, everything inside seemed to work. It had a full auto tiller system, it has a radar, it had GPS, it had stereo, all the electrical systems. It had an electric winch for the anchor up front. But what wasn't working was the diesel. There's a 20 horsepower Yanmar that the previous owner had disassembled. It was completely missing the head, and there was obviously undergoing some maintenance and service when they last set sight of it. That meant the boat as a whole was quite valueless to most people, because without a running engine, the cost of installing an engine on top of a used boat like this is quite exorbitant. But for our purposes, that made it just the absolute prime candidate to pick up. So one thing we're keen to experiment with in this boat conversion is higher power motor solutions. A vessel of this displacement and size is probably going to need about twice the power as Shamrock in order to reach comparable speeds. And the motors that we've been using, just the one all-axle hub motor, even in the thicker 45mm stator variant, is definitely going to overheat if we try to run it at twice the powers we've been running at continuously. One of the most tempting solutions that we've been asked about and have been brainstorming is, well, can't you just stack two motors back to back and just get double the power that way? And that seems easy to say until you think about the complexity of the fact that the whole motor's turning and the shaft itself is still, and we have to somehow deal with exiting the cables from that still shaft. But we put our heads together and actually came up with what seems to be a workable solution. So here we have a motor that has the cables exiting from a totally hollow central cavity, and these wires can simply feed through the hollow cable of the adjacent motor, allowing us to stack 2 or even 3 motors, one directly behind the other, and double or triple the motor power capability. Having multiple smaller motors instead of one big motor is a little bit more expensive and less efficient, but it also gives the benefit of totally built-in redundancy. You now have a totally independent drive system, so if any one motor controller or one motor has issues, the other one can of course pick up full duty. So we'll be testing and exploring how this idea works out and getting ourselves closer to having what we think is a unique conversion system option for boats of this size class. If you're interested in the direction that this stuff is going, please follow along with this channel and stay tuned to any announcements that we might make for additional pilot or beta testers wanting to explore these direct drive motor options that we're producing. We certainly think this stackable motor solution is going to give a really versatile platform to potentially convert and retrofit boats of this size class.